Pnawn da pawb, good afternoon everybody. Croeso i'r cyfarfod sy'n delio gyda cyllideb 24-25. Welcome to the Finance Panel meeting to deal with the budget proposals for financial year 24-25. Thanks for all the panel members for joining us today. We have David Thomas as a finance member for the Cabinet, so thank you, David. David will kick off, but can I also thank Jane Thomas, our Section 151 officer, and who has a new role within the council now as well. Congratulations, Jane. And it's good to see a number of officers here. James Chappell, Jackie Pugh, Mary Thomas, Craig Flynn. I'm sure you can all introduce yourselves as and when you are called. And good afternoon, James, as well. James Gibson-Watt, our leader, has joined us. So good to see you, James. And please chip in whenever you wish. So, felly, peth gynta, first thing, we'll go over to Councillor David Thomas, who is the portfolio holder for finance, to give us a quick overview of the budget. Dr. David.
Thank you, Chair. You'll see that you've had numerous reports in your meeting pack relating to the budget. I think there's not far off 1,000 pages there, so I'm sure you'd have found your way through those and certainly read those that would be of particular interest to you. I had preceded that report for a previous meeting, but for the purpose of today's meeting, I've tried to pull out the relevant parts of my earlier work just to set the scene for today's meeting, to help those at home who might want to follow proceedings today. So the budget proposal has been developed within an extremely challenging economic context and continued upward trend in cost and demand for our services, creating additional pressure on our finances for the next and future years. This, coupled with the outlook for public finances nationally, has led the Welsh Local Government Association to describe the situation across local government as being extremely bleak, and that the options for many local services will be unpalatable. Just to put that into a little bit of context, the actual pressures that were identified by local authorities in Wales leading up to the settlement totaled approximately £809 million. After the settlements and the awarding the AEF, it totaled £170 million. That's all authorities received in total, was £170 million against identified pressures of £809 million. So before we started, it's fairly obvious that there were going to be major challenges for all authorities, and obviously this authority, Powys included. The average over all Welsh authorities was 3.1%. So even with the additional funding provided through the settlement from Welsh Government, the stubbornly high levels of inflation currently being experienced means the funding provided is now worth less in real terms. We anticipate that we will continue to face financial pressures that outweigh the funding available throughout the period of our MTFS, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the Council in its current form is not sustainable for the longer term. Work to determine what the Council should look like in the future has gained momentum over the last year. This work is critical to ensure that the Council remains financially stable and provides sustainable services in the long term. As the work progresses, proposals will be developed for consideration before inclusion in our budget plans. We will be engaging with our residents and partners as we develop these plans. Obviously, I'm referring to the Sustainable Powys work there, which all members have had a briefing on. The proposal is based on the provisional settlement published by Welsh Government on the 20th of December. The final settlement will be published on the 5th of March this year. Powys has received an additional £6.381 million for 24-25, an increase of 2.8%. This is slightly below the average increase of 3.1%. Table 4 of the report sets out the gap between the Council's net budget requirement and the possible funding available until 28-29, based on the expected funding as set out in the medium-term financial strategy. An overall gap of £64.6 million is shown, and this would need to be addressed through realigning budgets to match the funding available. If we look at the 24-25 net budget requirements, the proposed draft net budget for 24-25 is £340.7 million, a £14.081 million or 4.3% increase on last year's budget. It includes inflationary pressures and additional service cost pressures of £18.2 million. And that includes pay awards for council staff, which are set nationally, non-pay general inflation, an uplift for pay and non-pay pressures across schools, demographic changes, contractual obligations, real living wage commitments, and service demand across adult social care and children's services, and the increased fire levy. The budget proposal includes additional funding of £3.6 million directly into schools' delegated budgets. This 4.2% increase is above the level of increase received by the council in AEF, which was 2.8%. The level of increase across the council services cannot be fully supported by Welsh Government funding, and increases in council tax and significant cost reductions and savings have had to be considered to propose a balanced budget. £10.7 million of reductions are being made. These reductions are focused on delivering services that are more efficient or that can be delivered at a reduced cost. Alternative sources of income and increased fees and charges have also been implemented, limiting the impact on the delivery of frontline services as much as possible without the financial constraints. Proposing a 7.5% increase in council tax for 24-25 provides 6.5% to support council services, with a further 1% to support the £1.1 million increase in the fire levy as set out in paragraph 3.46 of the report. If we look briefly at reserves, Chair, the council's reserves are key to our financial planning. Maintaining these at an appropriate level is central to our financial resilience and sustainability. They provide a safeguard against risk, unusual events, and future financial pressures. In the context of the need to maintain financial stability and flexibility moving forward, on the advice of the Section 151 officer, it's Cabinet's intention not to make any use of the General Reserve Fund for the 24-25 budget. That's just a very, very brief introduction to where we are, Chair. There's a number of officers, as you've already mentioned, with us today from Finance, and I'm sure that between us all, we'll be able to address any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's remiss of me. I've skipped the first two items on the agenda, which I'm sure Kath will be scolding me for. So if you don't mind, can I go back to apologies? We've got a couple, I know, Kath.
Yes, Chair, we've got apologies from Councillors Chris Walsh, Councillor Gareth Ratcliffe, Councillor Jeremy Pugh. We've got apologies from Lynn Hamilton, Chair of Governance and Audit Committee, who attends an observer, and the CEO, Emma Palmer.
Great, thank you. Next is declarations of interest. If anybody has an interest to declare, please say so, or any time during the meeting. And then item 3 is disclosures of party whips. No, none. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, David, for your introduction. Item 4 is the draft budget, which you introduced, gave us a very brief overview of the 534 pages we have in front of us today. And first, on this pile of paper we have, virtual paper obviously, is the report which you have summarized. So members, would you like to go, we have a section on the background to start with, stuff about the Welsh Government settlement that we received, and then also a bit of data around the changes to the data across various local authorities, and that impact that it has on the settlement that we receive. Then we get in a bit of a summary of the current year, and it talks about the draft MTFS, the MTFS principles as well. I don't think that they've changed, those 10 principles, which we've been guided by for a few years now. And any comments on those areas at all? Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think if I'm looking at the right report, there was a section in there around risk budget, and I just had a couple of comments on that. So I just wanted to understand whether that was like for unforeseen circumstances, or to reverse proposed bad decisions like the blue badges and the car parking structure, and also how is it calculated, because it's 3 million, it's less than 1% of the proposed net budget, and also why is that figure deemed to be adequate?
Yeah, I'm wondering whether to take that or pack that 3 billion in your car back somewhere, Pete. Yeah, no, I'm happy to address that now. Jane, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, councillors. The risk budget was set up several years ago now, and originally it sat at 2 million. And that budget is a revenue budget. It's held in addition to any reserves that we have. And it was set up in response to some of the significant pressures that were being requested through services, not all of which had actually materialised by the time we got to the applicable financial year. So on that basis, and to limit the impact on the overall budget plan, rather than fully fund absolutely everything, we do hold some of those pressures, if they've not actually materialised, at risk on our budget plan. So they therefore sit outside of the service budgets, and we draw on that risk budget throughout the year if and when those risks materialise to support those services with those additional costs. So that was the basis on which the risk budget was set up. It has been drawn on in every year that it's been available, and in terms of assessing the level of that reserve and that budget, we assess it in general terms across the whole of the budget. So I would reflect on delivery of cost reductions in previous years. We reflect on the level of actual reserves that we hold, and again, what level of risk we're holding outside of that budget plan. So it's based on that. It's been sufficient over the past few years. So taking all of that into account, I feel that it's acceptable in terms of the levels that we currently hold there.
Thank you, Jane. Did you want to come back, Pete?
Yeah, if I could, Chair. Yeah, sorry, Jane. So I was just trying to understand. So it's not a calculated figure.
No.
It's in a way your best assessment when you've looked across the whole picture, that you feel 3 million is acceptable to cover any risks that may or may not crystallise.
That's correct. And you also take into consideration the mechanisms for monitoring budgets, what corrective action we can take, and our abilities to do that during the year. So it is a complete picture and assessment of the overall budget.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask, just on follow up on that, Jane, is the any pay awards included in that 3 million potential pay awards?
Potentially they could be. What we have done, obviously, when we're assessing pay awards for the future, we look at where general inflation is and various other factors to estimate that, and we build a level in that we feel is appropriate. But what we have done over the last couple of years, particularly with inflation being so volatile and increasing, again, we set up a pay reserve a couple of years ago, and we've been able to draw on that over those last few years in the first year of pay awards if they exceed the level of our assumptions that we've got included. So there is some balance left in that reserve as well.
You haven't topped that one up?
No, not at the moment.
What does it sit? That's
I'll check. I think it was just over 1 million, I believe,
Just-
but
okay.
I'll double check.
so that's in addition to the 3 million, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, no, you don't have to check, but I'm guessing that's for that would cover part year pay awards, wouldn't it? And the
It would
full year effect
indeed.
would have to be funded at the next budget round.
Yes.
Did you want to come in on this, David, or shall I take Elwyn first?
Yeah, just very briefly, Chair, if I may, just to say that every budget by its nature contains some element of risk, and I think it's a credit to the foresight of previous administration and finance officers that we did set up a risk budget, and it's something that a lot of other local authorities don't have, and it has served us very well in the past. Just to make that point, Chair. Thank you.
Well, our general reserve, like many other, well, some other local authorities, is relatively low, isn't it? So I guess there's more imperative for us to put that extra buffer in place as well. So, Dr. David, Elwyn.
Well, it follows on from that, I think, really. I think it'd be useful, not just for us, but for the public in general, what is the strategy regarding the reserves in its entirety? If I remember rightly, about 6 million was squirreled away end of last financial year, beginning of this financial year, if I remember rightly. It is a question that will be asked, shouldn't some of that be used in the current year to keep things down, keep the tax level down, as I say, or are we like squirrels hiding the nuts away?
Can I leave that for now,
Yeah.
Elwyn, because there's a policy there, isn't there, on the reserves policy. Can we just remember that question, and I'm sure Jane will address it. Can we just leave that until we get to the reserves policy on the agenda? Diolch, Elwyn. There's other questions around the reserves as well. Yeah, going back to the paper, I roughly I got up to the draft revenue. There was one point there, David, you did refer to the Fire Authority, but there's also the Brecon Beacon National Park levy, which is 664,000. That's in paragraph 3.47. Has that changed this year at all? Was it slightly increased, wasn't it?
I haven't got the exact figure what it was the previous year, but I imagine there is an increase there. It's simply due to the high levels of inflation that they'd have experienced.
Okay. With regards to the Brecon Beacons National Park, how is that funded? Does all their funding come through the local authority and is passported onto the parks, or do they have separate funding from the Welsh Government as well? Or is there any top up that we have to do as a council to that funding? Jane, you're on mute.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'll
there we
take my mute button off. We do support the Brecon Beacons National Park through the levy. It isn't funded directly through the settlement. It's part of the overall settlement, although there's not a specific allocation within the settlement for it. So that is our contribution. Now, I'm not sure on the total funding streams that the National Park actually gets in total. I think there are contributions from other authorities that are part of that overall area. But I would have to find out a little bit more, but we have increased it slightly based on inflation. And again, they notify us in terms of our required contribution to that levy.
I'm guessing we were one of the biggest contributors because the biggest landmass falls into Powys, I'm guessing, because it touches both another half dozen authorities, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah, it would do. I haven't got the exact details of everything here. We can get that and forward it onto the panel.
Okay, that'd be brilliant, because there's probably highlighted interest in that at the moment because of the discussions around the 4th National Park, which would affect northern parts of Powys. So, there's issues around that, and understanding how it's funded is quite crucial to the discussions, I think, going forward. But that's that to one side. Just going back to your report, David. We have table 6. no, table 5, sorry. The one I always flick to first when the budget pack comes through, to seeing the shifts in the various funding for different services across the council. We and it's a summary of the pressures we face there. There's nothing being put against the teachers' pay award. Was that a deliberate decision or not? Why was that decision taken? Jane or David?
The Teachers' Pay Awards, that's funded through the increase in the overall education budget.
Yes, we can see that 3.6 million uplift. But why have you treated it different to the other services, which is quite different this year compared to previous years?
I think oh, sorry.
Go on, Jane. Yeah.
I think delegated is different. Schools are delegated with a pot of money within which then they plan their own individual budgets through the governing body. So they are slightly different to other services across the council. In the background, we have been working with schools and we understand the pressures and so on that will impact on their budgets. And part of that is considered in the overall assessment when we are looking with Cabinet as to how much money is available to be able to support delegated schools in the future years. So that information is in the background, but I think because of the way schools are funded, we very much saw it as a better way of providing the information to everybody is to show the level of increase that schools will have. It is then for them to decide how they issue that across their own budget headings.
But it's the first time you've taken this approach, and it's not really. It doesn't show the pressures, and we come to the pressures when we come to that paper. Perhaps I'll leave it there for now. But it doesn't show the public the degree of pressures of the wages that the school delegated is facing. And I know we've discussed it slightly at the LNS scrutiny the other day.
I think
but I was just wondering why the change of approach, really. It's just a matter of opinion that is a better way of presenting it. As simple as that, is it?
I think so, and it was my suggestion in terms of delivering it in that way. But as I said, the full assessment is done of the impact of that potentially on schools when Cabinet is considering the funding that can be provided.
Okay. I don't agree with you, but it's your good. Right. Thanks. Any other comments? Moving on to the. I was looking at the next table. It's just a point to note, really. It's the first time the council tax raised within Powys has gone past the £100 million mark. It's on table 6. It stands at will stand at £105 million, and the previous year it was about £98 million. So a substantial sum of money raised from the residents of Powys County Council to deliver the services.
Yeah, that would be in line with the council tax base increase as well, because of property values within the county, and obviously that in turn means that we get less RSG from Welsh Government, so we have to cover more of our expenditure within council tax.
It is frustrating. What is our council tax base? Is 68 something?
I think it is about yeah.
It's around that figure.
Yeah, it's about 68.
The figure for you,
yeah.
I was going to pick on an officer there. I can see Craig's name. You wouldn't have it as a tip of your fingers, Craig, or not? Probably not. That's unfair of me.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the tax base for 24-25 is 64.536.
Oh, 64.
64,536, yeah.
536. Sorry. I'm getting mixed up now. So how many property? Yeah, that's after the exempt ones, isn't it?
That's the Band D equivalent.
Band D equivalent. Oh, how many properties that are actually, okay, that's Band D equivalent. Okay,
After, yeah.
okay, because there's some, well, we've discussed that in the past, there's quite a few properties that don't fall into that category, aren't there?
I think, Chair, if you want the detail around that, I'd refer you to the council tax base report that was considered
back in
by
November.
Cabinet back in November. That's
Yeah.
got the full details of the whole calculation in that.
Okay. And then just one other point from table 6, we are sort of 31% self-funded now. Because the council tax increase, it will be bigger than the increase from the Welsh Government. That's shifted up a bit, isn't it? It was 30 point something last year, it's 31% now, which compares, you know, when other local authorities are down at the 20%, even though their ability to pay is so much better. Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's just a bit of a comment actually. Looking the paragraph underneath the table, where it says careful consideration to affordability for parish residents. Is there a table of those considerations anywhere at all that we could look at to see what was considered?
I think there's a lot more information around those levels and consideration of the discounts and exemptions and so on in the impact assessment itself. There's quite an extensive section in there that goes through each of those factors as part of that consideration.
We can. I was planning to have a quick look at that impact assessment later. Remember that question, and Jane can point us to the correct section when we come to that.
I think we've also increased the amount of money available in the council tax reduction scheme to help the most vulnerable residents in the county as well. And that's an important factor.
Is that all over and above what we have to do by legislation, or is that in line with legislation?
We're paying over and above what we have to do on a regular basis, unfortunately, but that's the nature of things. You know, we've got to fund our services, and unfortunately, that's where we are.
I thought Welsh Government provided so much funding for that.
They do.
But it's never enough.
No.
No.
It's significantly below.
Yes.
Again, I think we have to top it up by a considerable amount
Yes,
to be able to fully fund that scheme.
Yes, to fully fund it, but we are not paying over and above what we have to do by legislation, do we, or not? There's
some discretionary elements to our council tax reliefs. Again, they are quite extensive, and we can provide you with the full details around that, but there are some discretionary elements that each individual authority would consider based on our own circumstances and so on. Can you, is it possible to sum up those, you know, what sum that amounts to of those discretionary elements? I can get that information for you, yes. Because potentially that is an area where obviously discretionary, isn't it? And it's a political decision around those. It would be good to see. I don't think it's that big, is it, from what memory? I don't think so, but I would have to get the information to give you a firm figure.
In most cases where you've got a discretionary award, it is based on a property being uninhabitable for a short period of time, perhaps flood, fire or something. Yeah. Obviously, there are some cases where there's extreme, and I emphasize extreme hardship, that we might consider discretionary. Yeah, and sometimes Welsh Government, when there was flooding in Crickhowell, there was a discretionary scheme that was funded by Welsh Government, wasn't there? There will be some. So, you know, there's stuff like that as well. But it'd be good to understand the sum total of that, Jane. Yep. And thanks, Pete. And remind us when we get to the impact assessment, to have a look at the other stuff. Right. At the end of this report, we have really important part, section 4, which is the opinion of the section 151 officer. And do you want to summarize that, Jane, or do you mind taking a couple of questions? It might be easier to take questions. It's hard to summarize it because I think the assessment is based on each of those factors. So yeah. I think it's probably easier to take questions, Chair. Yeah, okay. And I guess paragraph
4.20 is the most important one at the end, where you give your assurance. Right. I've underlined or put a star by one. Financial position of many schools is also being impacted by the rising cost of and reducing funding in response to both pupil number reductions and poorer funding sentiment. Pupil number reduction is relatively unimportant in this budget, isn't it?
It is overall. I think when you look at the net change in pupil numbers, the adjustment is something like 26,000. However, there are changes across each sector. So we'll be more aware that secondary schools, I think secondary and primary, are reducing in numbers, although special schools has increased. But it's important that schools consider that change in pupil numbers as they plan their budgets and look at the teachers that they need to have available to support the curriculum and so on. So it is an issue, and I think in the past we haven't always seen schools respond as quickly as maybe they should to a fall in pupil roll, and I think that's where we have seen schools increase their deficit positions over the years, because they haven't necessarily responded to that challenge.
But it can be, when the reduction is relatively small, it can be difficult to respond when it's just a couple of pupils in each school.
It can indeed. Similarly with rising numbers.
Yeah, I can see Mary's turned the camera on, which, when I see that, I always know there's an answer about to come. Mary.
Diolch. I was just going to sort of confirm what Jane was saying. Really, a lot of the issues that we've seen with some of the historic deficits is around not reacting to that decline in pupil numbers quickly enough, and it's a difficult process for schools, isn't it? Because they're concerned that if they react to it, it might make their school less attractive. So they're reluctant to do it, but that just stores up that issue then for future years, and it becomes a bigger issue for them to resolve then, because they've got a historic deficit to try and manage as well. So it's important that they do react to that as quickly as they can, really. And that's what the school's finance team and in conjunction with the school improvement advisors and HR will be supporting them with.
Yes, no, I do appreciate that, but you raised that point in paragraph 4.9, but the demographic change is only 27,000 out of a budget of 84.
Only in this particular year, as I said, some schools are playing catch up as a result of falling numbers in the past few years as well. Yeah,
I appreciate that, but 27k out of a delegated budget of 87 million isn't.
Not in the overall scheme, no.
No, okay.
There is quite a significant split between mainstream schools and special schools, though. So the special schools are seeing their numbers increase, whereas the mainstream schools, I think, are seeing their numbers and therefore their funding decrease by about 200,000. So that 27,000 is that net figure for the whole of the schools net, really.
And I think it's demonstrated in the I can't remember what it's called now, of the school service, the FRM of the school service, isn't it? That's how demonstrated there, isn't it? Okay. But it'd be good if the figure could be quoted, really. And in section 4.11, there's a just reference to transforming education program. He talks about the transforming education program enabling council to realign limited resources to improve provision. Is that evidenced in this report somewhere?
Not so much in this report individually. I think in terms of the transforming schools overarching programme, that is very much driven by improving outcomes for pupils, by getting, from a financial perspective, that's helped in terms of economies of scale and so on that we've seen in the past. But most of the change is very much linked to that pupil entitlement and pupil provision and improving that across our schools. And that's very much the driver, I think, in terms of that transforming education programme. Any savings that can be then released as a result of that are currently being reinvested through the rest of the delegated pot, so that those resources are spread in a slightly better way to achieve those outcomes.
Okay, thanks.
It
Elwyn.
does-
Oh, sorry, go on, David.
just very quickly, that it does caution as well, a point that we did discuss at Learning and Skills around the capital programme, with regard to the fact that we've got to question whether the pace of change can keep up with a financial challenge. And that's a consideration that we've got to monitor very, very carefully, because that points to the affordability and good financial management.
Well, that touches on actually what exact point I was going to ask, because on one hand, we number of things come together here, and we've got falling school numbers. There's reserves, especially in the secondary, have gone, which I would labour, but I know is a big concern. So, and everybody's talking about transformation, yet the capital expenditure seems to have come down substantially in the coming years. So that's, yeah, so in many ways, David, you've touched on it before I've asked the question really.
Yeah, I think, had we gone, if I can use the term, hell for leather around capital expenditure, you'd be saying now that we've placed this authority in a highly precarious position with regard to our capital financing requirements. I think we've been prudent, we've monitored, we've checked for affordability before progressing. With regard to the school's transformation programme, it is there, it is progressing, and the future plans are very, very clear within the programme itself. But, you know, the pace has to be monitored, and we have to check affordability on all occasions.
Yeah, David.
But there is clear evidence in the capital strategy of the programs being pushed back. We can come to that.
Yeah,
when we look at that just very quickly.
Yeah, we've had this discussion previously at Learning and Skills, and I think we touched on the capital programme and economy and residence scrutiny yesterday. But a lot of determining factors have been there. We've had to take that into consideration, as the significant increases in interest rates and the impact of high rates of inflation on the actual costs of these projects going forward. So top priority to ensure the financial stability of this authority going forward has to be affordability. And that's what we are doing. That's not to say that we're not going to progress. We will progress, but possibly the pace of progression we'll have to check along the way and take up every opportunity as and when it arises. And this is why the discussion around capital receipts that we were having earlier at the start of this meeting, because, you know, before we went on air, actually becomes a priority.
Yeah. Yes, there's two sides to that equation, you know, and is well rehearsed,
two sides to every equation, isn't there?
including a huge maintenance bill.
Absolutely.
And the cost of running all these schools, and possibly a deficit in the provision delivered to the pupils across powers. Right, and I've highlighted other little bits of stuff. Any other comments on this? And Pete, before I come to paragraph 420, I was going to say, but Pete.
Oh, okay. I hope I haven't got there in front of you then, Chair. Apologies if I have. I suppose it just goes back, touches slightly back on the earlier question around the adequacy of the risk budget. I read in paras 4.7 and 4.8, they seem to be giving me the assurance that the reserves and the risk budget are more than adequate. So that was the good news side. Whereas 4.20 then goes on to the bad news side and so starts putting on the caveats around heightened level of risk, and they're at the lower end of acceptability. So there seemed to be a sort of slight contradiction for me between those paragraphs, and I guess just asking for a bit of, I suppose, either context or reassurance, Jane, around which is the right message, the good news or the bad news paragraphs?
I think it's both, to be honest. And I would say that as I've included both in the description, but it's about making sure that we have an appropriate level of reserves. Now, in terms of that appropriateness, it can be at a minimum level and still be appropriate, or it can be at a much higher level where you would consider that more appropriate. So it is having that balanced figure. You know, we don't want to hold too much in our reserves that more than covers appropriate levels, because that impacts on the revenue budget and the council taxpayer inevitably. So it is about assessing it and holding at that very optimum balance. And I think we have seen in the past where we haven't necessarily touched our general fund reserve for a number of years. It's held at 4% of the net revenue budget, which is quite low. And I think based on that, you know, we wouldn't want that to reduce any lower than that. Should we need to withdraw on that general fund reserve, we would have to consider replenishing it in future budgets. And that's what we have done in the past, not recently, but previously we have had to top up those reserves to maintain that balance. So I do think it's appropriate levels based on the assessment, but that is still at the minimum level of that appropriateness.
Okay, understood, thanks.
Thanks, Pete. And the words in 4.2 are adequately robust, but a highlighted level of risk remains. Is that clearly there's always risk or heightened level? Is that level of risk greater than last year?
I think with inflation as it is, we're seeing a decline now in terms of the levels of inflation. If that continues, I think our level of risk reduces. So I think it's still heightened because of the volatility out there and how world events impact on things like that as well. You know, we've seen a lot of shocks over the last 3 or 4 years that we wouldn't have seen in previous years. So I think that's why I'm highlighting that there is still that heightened level, because we are living in an uncertain world at the moment, and we have to consider that when we're considering the levels of reserves that we hold.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I just?
Go on, Dave, yes.
I think it goes without saying, if we're using the terms heightened level of risk, you've got to take into consideration the geopolitical nature of events at the moment. You've only got to watch the news every night. And it's simply, you know, saying that we're monitoring this very, very closely. And whereas I've always said that, you know, every budget has an element of risk in it, that because of these events, you know, there is a heightened level of risk. It's simply emphasizing that fact, and it needs increased monitoring.
Thank you, David. Pete?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Understanding what both Jane and Councillor David has said as well. I suppose just a question for my understanding, really. So, in terms of our risk management function, do they come and do any risk assessment work on this, Jane, or is this just solely your if you like phrase or assumption of a heightened level of risk?
It's based on everything, isn't it? I don't think you can pinpoint one individual thing. That level of risk is driven by economic factors. It's based on the robustness of the estimates that we have. It's based on the delivery of cost reductions. It's also based on our risk management processes across the council and how easily we identify and manage risk. So I think, you know, there's not one single factor. It is a combination of everything that I have to consider when giving that opinion.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Great. Can we? Oh, Gareth.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Jane, in that paragraph, Jane has been asked to give her opinion of the risk associated with this specific annual budget for 1 year, but this budget has been presented in a wider context, particularly where Jane goes on in that paragraph to refer to the medium term where the risk heightens. So I can understand why she can give it the tick in the box for this year, but when you look at the context whereby these cumulative increases in the budget deficit over the next 2-3 years and beyond, it might not be a matter for this specific requirement, but what about the wider risk register of the council? Because it's been a lot of work has gone into balancing this budget, and in future years there's talk about how important, I think it was in Councillor Davies' introduction, how important sustainable powers is going to be in achieving doing things differently and the larger cost reductions. So what is the council's view in that wider time horizon and the increased risk associated with it? Because the fundamental importance of sustainable powers can't be underestimated, but it's got to secure these fundamental changes. That's the first thing. But the time horizon for achieving them, the clock will start ticking next financial year. So there's a risk associated. The council may come up and agree these fundamental changes, but you still got to implement them, and that will take time. And I know from my own experience, organisations are always very ambitious in how quickly these are going to be achieved.
Jane or David, would you like to comment on that?
If I come in
Slightly longer term.
Initially, I mean, clearly in the MTFS and this budget report, you see that budget gap being projected over the next 5 years. We are working with uncertainty there because we do not know what our funding levels will be next year and the year after. We are very much working on a 1-year settlement. However, the work that's been undertaken through the Wales Fiscal Analysis team, looking nationally and the impact that could have on Welsh Government budgets, clearly they are highlighting to us all that we are likely to continue to see much lower levels of funding. And I think part of their work has actually indicated that the only increase in funding we may see over the next couple of years will be through any increases in council tax. And it is those assumptions that have provided the costings that we're looking at now in terms of that fundamental gap moving forward over the next 4 years, which is standing at 64 million. Absolutely sustainable powers and the work that we need to do as a council to change the way we deliver services and what we can afford to deliver is going to be fundamental to bridging that gap. When making the assessment on this year's budget, I have to be clear and give a level of assurance that this proposal in itself doesn't have an adverse impact on that going forward. And absolutely fundamental to that is taking decisions now that reduce our cost base, because it is only by reducing that cost base we can limit the impact on our council taxpayers. And that is absolutely fundamental to that financial stability going forward over the next few years. So it is an assessment of this budget, but we do have to consider some of that I think as we go forward. But the whole council is going to have to be, and I've pointed this out, I think in member development sessions, the whole council is going to have to be fairly brave in some of those proposals coming forward over the next few years to ensure we can bridge that gap and be able to provide services to those that are most reliant on the council. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be able to do all that we are currently doing. And I think working with the public, engaging with the public through these next few years as we deliver on sustainable powers is absolutely critical so that they can understand that position we face, but also what they can do as individuals as well to help us get to the place we need to be over the next few years.
So that risk that you've just described, and I agree with you 100%, Jane, has that been reflected in an appropriate adjustment of the corporate risk register associated with sustainable powers?
It is one of the key corporate risks is around that financial sustainability. And of course, that's been heightened with what we've seen across a number of authorities, all in England at the moment in terms of their financial sustainability. But with the challenges ahead, all councils in Wales are actually looking and learning from some of what's happened in England at the same time as well.
Can I just add very briefly to that, Chair? It goes without saying that the challenge ahead of us, it has to be mitigated, because the consequences of not mitigating it are unthinkable. But just for reassurance, I was fortunate enough, if fortunate is the right word, to attend a briefing by the Chief Commissioner for one of the large authorities in England that actually went bankrupt. And during that presentation, it became very, very apparent to me that where he was talking about mitigating measures to avoid that type of consequence, it was reflecting on our Sustainable Powers programme. And I actually turned to our chief exec at the time, and Jane was there as well, and I said, this is Sustainable Powers. So please take some reassurance that in many ways we are a step ahead, but I do accept that the challenge is the implementation, and it needs to be sooner rather than later. I accept that, Councillor Gareth. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth, and I'm sure you on audit committee will keep a constant eye on the risk register anyway going forward.
Yeah.
So I wanted to move on to the medium-term financial strategy, which does pick up some of the stuff around the the longer view. But James, did you want to come in on that quickly, or do you want to keep it until we go to the MTFS?
It's all right. You've got plenty to do, and in a way that the discussion is sort of diverting a little bit away from directly on the report, isn't it? And I mean, it's a really important issue, but I'm happy to wait. Happy to leave it for now. But fine, thank you.
Thank you. I just one last question. The overall spend in Powers, the net is 340 million or so. What proportion of that is wages? How much is a 1% increase in wages worth these days?
What's the total wage bill? It's about 215 million. Jane will confirm it now, but I think it's about 215.
You're on mute, Jane. Because that has a huge impact on
yeah, the gross employee budget, I think in the budget book for the current year, it's about 215 million. And I know in the MTFS, we do give you that sensitivity analysis about what a 1% change. I think we've seen this year, of course, the total gross budget will have grant funding in it as well.
Yeah.
And that could distort sometimes what the council would have to fund in terms of that percentage uplift, but it roughly equates to about £1 million for every 1%, which is very fortunate for me to remember at the moment, but no doubt that will change, but it's roughly around that.
Yes, which is roughly the same amount as 1% council tax as well, remarkably.
Happens to be, yes.
Right. We'll go to the medium-term financial strategy. It's a really interesting document. It's on page, I think I wrote it down somewhere, page 35. I think it's and about 35 pages up to page 70-ish. This is produced every year. We could discuss this for a whole day in itself, Jane, and you've reflected some of the changes, like in figure 1 with the where you show the gap, and clearly you have your worst case and most likely and cases. But do you want to pick out different areas of this? I want to focus a little bit on page 14 where it talks about grants, and also page 26 where we're talking about the sensitivities before. But what changes are there in this report this year compared to last year's? Do you want to draw our attention to any particular areas?
I think, you know, the format of the report is very much the same as last year, but I think the content is quite different across it. So obviously, when you look at the background and some of that information, we are taking the most up-to-date economic context nationally as part of that. We've also built in terms of those forward projections, as I said, the analysis that we're getting nationally as well. So those will be quite a change to what we're expecting coming through in time. The demands will change slightly. We are a very pay orientated organisation. So obviously the impact of pay inflation will be more significant or less significant based on what those pay awards come through at. So although all of these headings are fairly consistent, I think the content within which one is written, it does change very much so depending on what's happening there. So you will see those updates all the way through it. And then of course we've got the 5-year forecasts and the approach then in terms of how we deal with those projections going forward. That is quite key. And I think we're through the Sustainable Powers programme, that is very much heightened to where we've probably been in previous years, and making sure that we can deliver the change needed as part of that. So those would be the overall, but there are quite significant changes to the content throughout this document.
Yes, and thanks, Jane. Members, are there any areas you wish to focus on? In figure 4 there, you see Welsh Government financing as well, where their £23 billion of funding comes from various areas. In the last couple of years, we've seen the Welsh income tax element. Not that that's been varied at all by Welsh Government. And then we got lots of stats. Well, one interesting point I see is on figure 6, budget changes, where you got those big services, children's, adults, and education, and you can see the significant changes in those children's in the last 5-6 years, or 5 years has gone up by 56%, adults by 25 or 26%, and education by not quite 9%. Overall 20% increase in those big areas. And I'm guessing those figures there also include all the grants as well, don't they? The 101 million for education includes all the grants as well, doesn't it?
These would be net budgets, so the income would be reflected in those figures as well. So you would see the grant spend and the grant income, so it is the net budget.
Okay. Yes, in education, that doesn't make much difference, does it?
There are some significant grants. I'm thinking post-16 grant. I can't remember them all now. I know foundation phase grant used to have a significant impact. We've had pay award grants and all sorts. So some of those are significant and would have a big impact, yes.
Yeah, so it's delegated plus the grants, isn't it, basically?
Yeah, but that's the net position.
Net of what?
Net of the grant income. So this is the actual impact on the council's revenue budget and what the council has to support in addition to the grants. Am I making sense?
Perhaps me.
It includes the school service budget as well as schools delegated budget, so it's the combination of the two.
Okay.
Another 20 million there for the
yeah.
school service.
Okay, I assumed it was the foundation and sixth form plus the delegated, but okay, it's service as well. Diolch, Mari. Diolch, because it didn't quite add up in my head. Elwyn.
I'm not sure if this is the relevant place, but we have heard last week, I think, wasn't it, about the extra 25 million come to Welsh Government as a result of the Barmont formula. Have we had any indication of how much and when, etc., we can expect in news on that? Because obviously we should be, I don't know, 1.5, 1.7 million, and every penny helps. Because I've heard a rumour might be allocated a ring fence specifically for the care side of things, and perhaps all the social services.
At the moment, we don't have any further information around that. We did have a Welsh Treasurers meeting last week where obviously we have those regular discussions with officers across Welsh Government, and no decision has been made at a Welsh Government level yet to indicate whether we will receive any of that as a consequential, or indeed how that will be allocated. So at the moment, I have no further information.
Okay, can I just a suggestion? I don't know, this isn't again not the right committee, but flagging that, should we as an authority perhaps be arguing the case, as I know other rural authorities lost out pro rata on the main allocation for extra divvy of funds for those, I know Ceredigion, Conwy, etc., are in a similar position, arguing that case as a joint effort.
We the first hope is it all will be passported on to local authorities. Next call is around the rurality issue that Elwyn sort of focuses on, but also there's priorities within the council as well. You know, it could be worth what 1.2 million pounds for us, pro rata-ish.
Yeah, I think it'd be anyway, James.
James, yeah. Your
sorry.
thoughts, James?
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, I sort of fortuitously, there is a WLJ Rural Forum coming up, and obviously the financial settlement is one of the key agenda items in that. There is, from what I've been told, there's been quite a lot of some fairly strong lobbying by South Wales authorities in particular to say they should all come to us, and those people in rural areas have had enough already. So I guess we're facing something of a political battle. Although presumably, if it is allocated to local government in general, there'll be a formula for that. I don't know. I don't know, and I don't know what's happened in the past. How these late increases have suddenly been distributed, and Jane would be able to tell us that, I'm sure. But I mean, who knows quite how this will be handled now? I mean, some of the South Wales authorities are in really dire straits. I mean, we are relatively comfortable compared to the smaller valleys authorities like Torfaen and Blaenau Gwent and Merthyr, who have negligible, if any, reserves to call on, who have already set last year's budget, I think, using reserves as revenue to a certain extent. So clearly, they are looking for anything they can get. So it's going to be, there's bound to be an argument about this. And it's going to be really interesting to see how the WLGA handles that, because to be fair to Chris Llewellyn and his team, they are, my experience there, being as even-handed as they possibly can be, and are trying to keep us all together and not let it descend into nasty arguments, and so far successfully, I have to say. We've all acted very much as one. So we'll see, but it is going to be tricky.
Well, just remind the chief exec and the leader of the WLGA that we are self-funding ourselves over 30%, 31% these days.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm aware of that. Yes, I mean, I'm sure the thing is, what we don't want it to descend into is particularly a sort of party political battle. I can imagine that the leader of Gwynedd Council is going to be pretty strong-minded about this, and won't be in any way reticent about saying what he wants to say, and whether that will be effective or whether that will just wind people up badly the other ways remains to be seen. My approach is to try and be as cooperative as possible. I think we have to be, because to a greater or lesser degree, we're all in exactly the same position, and we're in the middle of the pack, really, in that respect. Yep. But
and a number of those valleys authorities set a council tax rate of 0 just before the election as well. But I'll skate over that for now.
But the trouble is they just don't have a very big financial base. They're very small authorities. And Merthyr's population is 60,000 people. It's less than half of ours, and it has a huge impact.
And then if the additional funding does come to here, clearly it'll be a cabinet decision of where that's allocated, because this was going to be my last question for today. But I'll give you heads up, early warning. If you had £1 million extra in your budget, Jane and David, don't answer it now, leave it till the end of the meeting. But where would your priorities be? Where's the biggest risk? Where would you put that £1 million? But I'll leave it there for now. We'll go back to the MTFS and continue through that. I've forgotten where we are. And just to emphasise that point, James, in Figure 12, you can see the average council tax paid by Powys is significantly higher. It's 14% higher than the average Welsh average, even though we've got one of the lowest hourly wage rates in Wales.
Yeah, this is I mean, this is the inherent unfairness in a property-based tax system. I mean, and you know, it's there's nothing we can do about that in the short term. And unfortunately, the reforms that are being proposed for council tax will probably make this much worse. But
exactly,
but of course, the counter argument that the South Wales authorities will use is that their ability to raise much money through the council tax is limited by the lower property values that they have. So and the number of houses that they have in the lower property bands as a result. So it is a bit swings and roundabouts, isn't it? But you're right. I mean, we have it's not just the fact that we have low wages. It's just that you can live in a valleys town and not have a car and get around fine. You know, you do buses and trains and all sorts, but we don't have that advantage. Most people have, not everybody, but an awful lot of people have to have a car, and many households depend on 2 cars, and they're jolly expensive to run. So we get a triple whammy, and we have lots of detached houses, which are more expensive by their very nature to heat and light, and because they have 4 outside walls rather than 2. So it's no, all these things add up. It's really difficult.
We're really well aware of all the challenges, but stick a copy of the MTFS in your back pocket whenever you go down to the WLGA, David, leader, and bang it on their desks.
We'll do our best.
Right. Thanks. I wanted to get to the sensitivity on this paper. I've lost it somewhere now. Which page is that? Anybody?
It's page 15 of the MTFS, page 60 on the thing, section 4.1.
I hadn't quite got to it. Thank you, Jane. So can you explain this? The sensitivities. Clearly, a 1% increase in council tax is just under £1 million, but that's gross. But when you take out this council tax reduction scheme, what is it net?
It's roughly about 90,000, I think, the council tax reduction scheme adjustment.
So it'll take you down to 860-ish for 1% increase. Okay, and there's a gearing you have between the Welsh Government settlement and the council tax.
Yeah,
and then you got the sensitivities around the pay.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about 1% on the pay, but you weren't including the teachers when you're.
It's probably we would need to factor in the grants as well. So again, this is the overall impact, and it does skew it sometimes. But if we look at the pay bill, these would be the initial 1% change headlines.
So so pay, if everybody had 1% increase, could you just add those 3 figures together?
Not the bottom one, the 2. There'd be like 1.6 million would be across the 2 pay elements, wouldn't they?
Okay. Also, sorry. Yeah, of course. You're talking about non-pay costs at the bottom line.
Yeah.
Okay, and the grants back on page 14. You will. How many of these will you know before the? Is it page 14?
It is where we mentioned specific grants. Page 24. Is it? Sorry.
No, it's page 13, 14 of the. You're talking about the education grants. Sorry, small page 13, 14.
Oh yeah, sorry.
When do you know?
It's sometimes we don't even know until we get into the new financial year. So the figures that we've had here, just turn this heater off. These are the All Wales level. So our individual allocation is driven by the specific formulas that generate them, but these are at the All Wales level. We are expecting to get some more information around the grants as part of the final settlement. There has been very much a drive to try and rationalise grants and the administrative burden as a result of having all of those grants at a national level through Welsh Government. So we're not sure exactly what we're going to see. There is a lot of discussion going on at the moment, as you can see, with some of these education grants. They're being amalgamated. Some may yet transfer, not the education one specifically, but some of the grants that we've been receiving in the past may well transfer into the settlement at final settlement. So we're waiting to have the full details of all of that. And it's going to be very tight in terms of some of that. Some of it we may not know until we move into the new financial year.
But you haven't had any indication that there'll be substantial changes from last year?
We've had the All Wales figures, so that has showed us where grants are roughly going to stay the same, or whether they're going to reduce, or some may even increase a little. So services have looked at those grants list, and those have been factored into our budget plans, albeit some held at risk as a result of not knowing whether we're going to get those or not.
Because for delegated budget, for example, the foundation and post 16 is roughly £6 million on top of the delegated. You know, it's a huge sum of money, isn't it?
And that's no different to previous years.
No.
You know, very often we don't know until we get into the financial year exactly what we will be receiving.
No. So there's an element of risk. I do wonder if it's heightened risk because the Welsh Government are trying to claw back money. As you saw mid-year this year, they were re-looked at some of the budgets across the Welsh Government, and they clawed some back, didn't they? So it is a worry. Pete?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Can I just go back to figure 14 again? Sorry, on that sensitivity. I was just trying to understand that. So if I just looked at the 1% column, is that telling me that if inflation or prices go up by more than 1% we budgeted for, the total of all those figures in there is the impact on our cost? So what's that, 3.5, so almost 6 million under 1%?
No, it's not driven just by inflation. These would be, if we had a 1% increase in council tax, that would be the figure. If our settlement increases or decreases by 1%, that is the impact. And then the pay and the non-pay inflation similarly. So it is just recognising what a 1% change across each of those factors would be. So, you know, if the settlement goes up by 1% and pay doesn't, that would give us more funding, and vice versa. You know, that it's just some analysis that shows you what that 1% change could do.
So the minuses, in a way, Jane, are good news.
Well, they're minus because they're based on income.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And it almost all nets. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. It's a weird way to do some things. Right. Any other questions on this at all? Like, there's no assumptions in that sensitivity. That's accurate figures, isn't it? You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but your assumptions around the level of support from Welsh Government, you tend to look at the worst case most of the time when you're looking at the gap.
It's served us well, I think, in the past. We've worked to the worst case scenario. It's easier to pull back from the worst case scenario than go looking for further changes. So as a council, we have generally gone with that worst case scenario.
Okay. Okay. Any other stuff you want to raise out of this? You got the SIP pillars of resilience or stress towards the end. You know, these things have been around quite a few years now, haven't they?
They have,
And-
and I think we're making some progress in terms of some of those elements. There's still some work to be done, as we know, but I think the question around financial sustainability and resilience has really come to the fore in this last couple of years. And as I said, we've seen the impact of some of that across England. We're having to really focus on this and make sure that we are planning for the future, obviously in terms of the Future Generations Act and so on. That is exactly what we should be doing. So really having that focus and making sure we're doing as much as we can in preparation for what's ahead. And I'll answer your question now. If we were to get a further £1 million as a result of that consequential at Welsh Government, I think my initial advice would be hold it, use it next year as part of that budget plan for future years, because we are going to need every penny we can get our hands on to protect the council financially over the next few years.
Right, we'll come to the reserves policy afterwards and Elwyn's question around squirreling, but I know you don't particularly like that phrase. But before we leave the pillars of resilience, which is a positive element, it has got benchmarking in there, hasn't it?
Yes, a pet of mine, as you know, and we are making some strides into that, but not sufficient. We do need to understand our cost base a lot better than we currently do, and that's something I'll be pushing now quite significantly as we move into this next year.
Yeah, and I'd like to support you in that, whether we put that as sort of recommendation to cabinet and whatever. I think is a really important element there. So I thought I'd just give you that opportunity to bang on about it again. Right. We got the FRM afterwards. Nothing really surprising here, but there you're using that worst case scenario of plus 2.8 this year, and then -2 for the next 4 years, and that's a reduction, net cash reduction of over £4 million in each of the following years. Clearly, there's a huge difference between a plus 2.8 and a minus. It's a £10 million gap, isn't it? Swing.
I think based on what we're currently seeing, flat cash or -2 are the most realistic of those options. I hope we're wrong, but based on the analysis that we've seen, that's where we are at the moment. So I think working on that -2 scenario and having options for council to consider is the most prudent approach.
And then when we look at the top half of the table, you've got your pay inflation awards going forwards. What sort of percentages have you been, are those equivalent of?
I think we're at 4% for 25-26, and then that does reduce down over the future years by 1% a year, based on our assumptions that inflation will come back down to the target figures nationally. So it's phased at this point in time, but obviously we can review that each year as we get much more firmer figures closer to budget setting.
And clearly,
and similarly for non-pay inflation, the same.
Or that declines as well by 1%.
Yeah.
Is that 4%? The 2.2 million 4% in non-pay?
I think it is. I'd have to go back and check. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And that sort of brings us a little bit back to the reserve of about £1 million on pay. Clearly, a 1% switch would wipe that out, wouldn't it?
It would indeed.
I got no idea what the union asks this year. I got a feeling it's more than 4%, doesn't it?
We're waiting on that. You know, we know, again, it's that balance, isn't it, about how much we can build in and expect council tax payers to meet in terms of some of those costs, as opposed to holding some in reserve and meeting that challenge in the future year.
Clearly, there's a significant risk around that area of the council's business, isn't there?
Yeah.
And yeah, from what you're saying, from your 151 position, £1 million is a sufficient reserve to deal with those?
On the basis that we have other reserves as well. So, you know, it's looking at everything collectively.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Right, then we're into the cost reductions. These have been highlighted by the various scrutiny committees. Are there any areas that weren't covered? I've got a couple of little questions here, to be honest.
Yeah.
Are there any areas that haven't been sort of focused on by scrutiny committees? I did try and attend all of them, and I'm not 100% sure they covered all these areas. I just got one around. It's probably more to do with the charges, but possibly not. There's SLA agreements with schools and other bits of the council. Have those changed at all by inflation? Or so if say the SLA agreement with a school for HR function within a school, has that changed? Because that'll increase.
I'll ask Mary if she's still with us. She's still there. I know Mary does the detail around the formula funding and schools delegated. So generally, I think for the SLAs, they're adjusted, but the charge is adjusted and the delegated funding is adjusted. Mary, am I correct?
Yes, that's right. So what is put into the formula for delegated funding will match what the authority will be raising in terms of charges for those services, and schools do have the option with those that are funded by delegated funding to find those services elsewhere should they wish to.
Yeah. But that's not reflected in table 5 of the report. You know, that one with, you know, you got non-pay as at 0. And you've just got lump sum for the uplift.
For schools, yes, that's the basis that we've put it into the budget plan.
Mm.
But question is, are there changes to the SLA? Will the school delegate? I know you possibly could. You're funding it part of that 3.73 nets. Delegated, is an element of that covering SLA changes or charges?
It would need to, yes. Yeah.
Can you quantify that for the schools with?
I'd need to find that information, but we can get that for you, yes.
Are we talking tens or hundreds of thousands?
I don't think it's hundreds of thousands, but I'd need to get that information.
Okay. Diolch, Mary. Diolch yn fawr. Arwel.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah. No, just on the cost reductions or whatever, the savings, there was an item there, flagpoles, and we're going to save 20,000. Well, if we're going to save 20,000, what's it costing us at the moment? Or what will it cost us? And my theory, at the end of the day, well, are the general public bothered about flagpoles? If it's another 20,000 to the coppers, well, do away with them completely.
I don't know. That's a comment. I know it was part of the scrutiny challenge, and I think, you know, from what you're saying, that was part of the work that was looked at as to do we really need to keep all of these flagpoles when it has that level of cost attached to it, and that's why the proposals come forward.
Yeah, is 20,000 the cost for the county, or are we just doing away with some of them?
No, I think it's quite. I didn't realise we had so many, to be honest.
Well, exactly, Jane. I didn't. I was surprised when I could see the line in the budget model. I was, well, yeah, horrified, to be honest.
We can find out. It's because of the compliance testing and all sorts that goes with flagpoles. You don't just put them up and leave them. You have to test them every year and so on. So it's all part of that. But we can find some more detail. But as I said, that did come up at one of the scrutiny sessions.
Yeah, I think it was brought up by ERCG yesterday. So you either got a man going around giving it a kick to see if it's okay, or you got a man going around with a still saw to chop it down.
And the other thing, I'm not sure, is this section, about the green waste, the proposed charge going from £40 to £50. Are they? I always thought the green waste, we weren't looking to make a profit. We were just looking to cover costs.
It is about full cost recovery. I don't think we were necessarily covering all costs initially.
Right. Okay. No, because it just seemed okay. I know it went up at £2 last year from 38 to 40 or whatever, but I just thought the 40. I know it's. Well, I can't argue about the service really, and yeah, and it is a good service, but it just seemed a bit of a hike from, if it was a five, probably you could be acceptable, but going you only went £2 last year, from 40 to 50 this year seems. Has that been actually agreed, or is it just a proposal?
It's part of the budget proposal, so it's subject to approval by council, isn't it, when we consider the whole
I think in the commentary at the scrutiny committee, it was mentioned that it brings us in line with other local authorities as well, because we were providing the service under cost, so it's full cost recovery basically, and bringing us in line with other authorities.
Okay, yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Jane.
And it's quite awkward as well when you want to go up from 2 to 3 lorries. It goes up in steps.
All of that in, haven't you? Yeah.
And so you don't want it to be too popular, so you need an extra wagon to pick it all up. Right. I just got one frustration here, real frustration. When I look at last year's cost cost reductions, one of the HTR ones, there was an in-out process, so delaying the top-up of the vehicle replacement policy by £1 million. And then last year, there was a promise to reverse that this year. Has it been reversed?
I think just looking at it, I'm not sure that it has.
Because it doesn't appear in the HDR at all.
Let me have a look.
Or is it in the included in the pressures or not? I couldn't find it.
It's in one of them, and I'm trying to look to see where it is.
Just going on that, Aled, there's also a mention on the HTR that they're delaying depreciation of about 514,000 from this year and moving it to next year.
That's the one, isn't it? That's the one Aled's querying.
Is that the same one? I thought you mentioned £1 million.
So where's that? But because it's not depreciation, really, is it?
No, it's not. It's a calculation. It's a revenue contribution towards capital funding, isn't it?
And that's a completely different. That is.
Because I'm sure this is depreciation. It's on page 139.
139.
Well, wasn't there an in-year environment around something to do with that? Going back a few months.
It's a figure of 514,750, and it's been delayed this year and it's gone on to next year.
That was a budget change, I think, wasn't it, last year? Hang on, I've got a recap. What page did you say? Sorry, Councillor Arwell.
139. 139. I picked it up on, but I can't access my second screen, unfortunately, at the moment.
Yeah, there's temporary depreciation reduction and it's reversed in the following year.
That's it.
So you're extending the life of vehicles by 1 year, I'm guessing, is it?
Yeah, I think that was the consideration.
But that's different to...
Yeah, but is that penny wise, pound foolish, isn't it, really? Because it's going to cost us that much more next year too.
I think it's based as well on the level of reserve that we've currently got to support that funding stream. So they would have looked at both. One would be the period of replacement, but also how much is held in the reserve currently to be able to fund those next year. And that delay doesn't necessarily impact on that.
Okay.
So going back to just trying to look at price pressures. Going back to my point around this promise last year of reverting that cut.
Yeah, I think that's been delayed.
Oh. No. Alan, it's in the same table that Awa was just talking about. It's the next line down, I think. Is that the one you're referring to?
No, that's home to school transport underneath the temporary depreciation reduction.
I think it's the
No,
one,
no, the one above. Sorry, the line above. It's the 1.191. Is
Yeah.
that what you're referring to?
that's the one. I think that was going to drop back in this year, but it's been delayed for a further year.
Yes, but the promise last year was to put 2.589 in.
That was amended, I think, wasn't it? Wasn't it amended as part of the final budget debate? I'd have to go back and have a look. Sorry, I could have prepared better if you'd raised that one a little bit earlier, but I can have a look at it and give you a bit of a summary as to the position.
But yeah, I don't know. It was, I was listening into the HCR stuff yesterday a bit, and there's a thought that occurred to me. I just remembered about it, and
Oh,
so I
Marie's
find it
here.
so deeply dishonest about these documents are supposed to be run from year to year, as I see it, and
I'm
it's
just
dishonest
wondering.
to
Marie
not
is-
explain these changes.
Sorry, I'm talking over you.
Sorry,
but I
Jane,
think
go on.
Marie is here. I don't know if Marie can give some clarity. Yes, she is.
Hi everybody. Yeah, no, it hasn't been put back in due to the pressures on the HTR budget.
So it's delayed for another year, was it, Marie?
Yeah.
But that's not shown.
Well, it came out of the base last year.
Yeah.
And this proposes that it goes back in looking 25, 26.
Yes, but that's only 1.2 rather than 2 points. Oh no, it's a net that off, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, nice. Okay. Is that the? You're trying to do a quick calculation. Okay, so it's been delayed again.
Mm-hmm.
What does that revenue stand at now? That
The reserve.
reserve, yeah.
Marie, I'm sure can have a look for us.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'll have a look. Yeah.
Thanks. Because well, I'll pick that up again when we come to the capital program as well. Right, and these similar sort of stuff is going on with, you know, these are supposed to be sort of public-facing documents, and it's really difficult to and understand some of this stuff really. But there's similar sort of stuff going on with the adult social services, money going in and out.
Which one? See if we can give a bit more clarity then.
I printed these off as another set of papers, which they got the wrong numbers on now. Adults, there's a sort of million. Oh, Pete, you've got your hand up.
Yep.
Were you going to raise this or not? Because you.
No, I'm not sure actually, Chair. Apologies. It was a question around presentation, but it may not be that particular issue.
Okay, go on, fire away.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I suppose I was looking at the line, the remodeling the service delivery for the pupil referral units. Now I guess, and apologies, I wasn't learning in skills, and so I don't know what was said there, but I guess some of the non-financial impacts of this, such as I guess longer travelling time and cost of travel, may be picked up in the impact assessment. But in terms of the figure that or the two figures we're looking at there, what I was trying to ask is that the figure just from, if you like, remodeling the PRUs? Does it also, though, take into account, which I think other councillors may have mentioned previously, is like unintended consequences? So say the cost that if you move, say, one of the PRUs from Newtown to Brecon, then that might increase pressure on other services such as youth intervention. So is that just looking at the PRU, or is that also bringing somewhere in there an element of a budget to pick up on increased cost pressures on those other services? Does that make sense?
Yeah. David's got his hand up. I know there was quite a bit of discussion on this yesterday at the Learning Skills, and there's quite a bit of
if I may, Chair, I didn't want to address that Councillor Peters' question directly, but just to make a general observation that my understanding was that we weren't going to go into these individual cost reduction lines in detail, and that's why we haven't got portfolio holders here and officers from those service areas. So I think there was an email actually, and we did have some discussion about this, and I did say at the time that if there was a need to go into detail around these individual cost efficiencies, then it would be appropriate to invite portfolio holders, but that wasn't deemed to be necessary at the time. So whereas it's Jane and I can certainly, and the leader who attended some of the scrutiny committees, and indeed yourself, Chair, can attempt to offer some explanation around some of these. I just want to explain why we haven't got somebody here who can actually go into them in detail.
No, and I was just trying to say to Councillor Pete that there was quite a bit of discussion yesterday, and I think there was quite a bit of frustration by the detail within the impact assessment. I'm sure there'll be recommendations coming out of that as well. I know Kath has forwarded me some notes on that, which I haven't had a chance to look at this morning, to be honest. So sorry about that. James, leader.
No, I'm similar position to everybody else, really, in the sense I don't know the detail of this, in the sense of the impact and how it will be, how the savings will be achieved. But it apparently, and I think this came out at Learning and Skills yesterday, was that the numbers in our PRUs are very low, which is good, and that the intention is to accommodate many more of the children and young people in mainstream with appropriate support, rather than having them go to a separate people referral unit. And I think if it works, I think we'd all support that idea. So we've got 2 units at the moment, and yes, if you close one of them, then it leaves it just, they're opposite ends of the county, and it's obviously a huge distance apart. So I guess the remodel, and Lynette wasn't able to attend yesterday because she family issue she has to deal with, but so she couldn't provide the explanation. But I think there's a strong level of confidence that this saving can be achieved without any harm, in fact, and the service will be improved to the young people affected. So that's as I understand it, and I think we had a fair discussion at Cabinet about it as well. And we were reassured that this was both achievable and the right thing to do. So it's kind of doubly good in that respect.
We made different views a little bit, James, but
point taken.
Impact assessment was quite frankly inadequate, and it is the case for a number of the impact assessments. Councillor Pete.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to Leader and Councillor David for those extra comments. And apologies, I wasn't trying to go over the old ground that may have been done at another scrutiny committee. I was trying to use just that PRU line as an example of the question I was trying to ask, which was, are the lines in those cost reductions just focus on the cost reduction in relation to that item? So i.e. in this example, just the cost reduction from remodeling the PRU, or do they also, are they a net figure after all the other potential consequences have been taken into account? and that's across the board, I guess, not just the Prue line.
Can I just jump in there, Councillor Pete? I found the PIU. I think it's the bottom line was to reconsider the impact in the reduction of PIU would. Oh, sorry. Try and read it properly. To reconsider the impact a reduction in the PIU would have on schools' budgets and staff well-being of the learners remaining at their home school. So that that was reflected in the scrutiny. So hopefully, the Cabinet will respond to these recommendations, which would be considered at Cabinet at some point, James, in the next week or the week after.
Next week.
Next week, because there's a heck of a quick turnaround with the scrutiny. It's got to be in by tomorrow, isn't it? I think. So it always feels extremely rushed. Apologies. I'll take this behind the scenes somewhere to get a bit of confirmation around, but it doesn't seem to flow from one year to the next. There's some not glitch in the system, but it is not clear about what's happening from one year to the next, and it's lost in translation almost. Right. Where were we? Apologies, I got distracted. Were we looking at the cost pressures?
Can I just pick up on one element, Chair? You said, was there any areas of the budget that the scrutiny committees hadn't necessarily covered?
Yeah.
The only area that wasn't covered was the corporate services budget. So you'll be aware that we have a lot of quite an extent of budgets held centrally to do with council tax and all those various corporate things. So there were some pressures arising from that, and there were some cost reductions built in for that as well. So I have got a slide if you want me to just share that with you, similarly to what we've shared for some of the other areas.
Yes, please.
So I will just share my screen.
I can see there's a £1 million split between the pension actuarial, which was started last year, wasn't it? There's another £400,000 the next year, and then the capital funding cost of borrowing, and those are the only two cost reductions I've seen on my list.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, these were the areas. So you've got the council tax reductions scheme increase as a result of the increase in council tax. So that's 740,000. The fire levy and the increase there, which members are all aware of, was an additional £1 million. And then we've got the inflationary uplift on the national park levy as well. As a result of our pay award increases, we are having to pay more through the apprenticeship levy. So that's 162,000 pressure there. We have then made some reductions, and you'll be aware that some of these have been made in year as well, around the slippage on the capital financing revenue budget. We have seen an underspend this year, which we've utilised to help support pay awards. And that is making this permanent reduction against that budget. And then, of course, you've got the second year rollout of the actuarial pension review and that reduction in the contribution rates. So those are the elements that are sitting corporately as a result of the budget proposals. The one around the prudential borrowing, obviously, we do not need that at the moment. The whole financing strategy is based on what we do know around capital receipts and so on. So there is that a slight element of risk there that's been identified against the risk budget as well, in terms of those borrowing costs, particularly with some of the volatility around those percentages as well at the moment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jane. Yes, thanks for the caveat at the end as well. Can you forward those to Kath, please?
Yeah.
So, brilliant.
I'll stop sharing that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we can see the cost pressures. That's where I'd seen the £18,000 for the BM, the national park already. Okay. Other cost Yeah, that's the first page. Then. The cost pressures, again, I come back to education, and why aren't they sort of highlighted within that? All it's highlighted is the freedom leisure. And that's it, isn't it? Sorry, it indicates as no cost pressures on education, but I'm slightly frustrated that they're not itemized. You know, there's clear ones around pay, aren't there?
We've had that conversation already, I think, haven't we?
Yeah, okay. And then the early retirement. What is that exactly? I don't know if governance and audit has picked this up or not, Gareth. But what is that? I thought whenever there was an early retirement, there was a clear business case built, and it was self-financing. So what is this?
Let me just go to which page are you on now? Make sure I've got the right one.
138 of this pack, which is the finance.
So is this in
pack.
schools?
Under
Yeah.
education.
Yeah. So a business case is prepared for each considered early retirement. There are two differences in terms of individual staff members. So all council funded staff on the NJC scheme and who are part of the Powys pension fund, when any staff are released under that, there is a pension strain cost that is met in year one of that release. So that is clearly something that's factored into that business case to demonstrate affordability and cover those costs. They have to be within a 3-year period, I think, to allow those to happen. From a teacher's perspective, they are not part of the Powys Pension Fund. They are part of the National Teachers Pension. And for teachers, that cost isn't capitalized. There's an ongoing revenue cost that needs to be met should you release those teachers. And it is that cost that is captured in the education budget. And that particular pressure relates to the pressure on that overarching budget. And that's paid then for the extent of that retirement for that individual.
Would you describe that as an error within the business case?
But without going and looking, I can't recall the exact business case around teachers. It's not one that I regularly see. So it would still, I mean, the business case would still have to stack up in terms of the efficiency or the redundancy costs and so on as a result of that.
But there's obviously a gap, isn't there?
Well, it's just an ongoing contribution rather than a one-off.
Yeah, okay.
I think it was something that governance and audit wanted to have a look at in terms of a business case as well. They've asked for that to be reviewed.
But it should be funded from somewhere, that's my point, rather than being an additional cost on the,
It is an additional cost to the central education budget, but that's so that the school can realise the savings immediately. So it does impact on the school's delegated budget. There are some decisions that are not made for efficiency reasons. The school would be meeting those ongoing costs.
Yeah, okay. No, just that's like frustration around that. I wasn't going to spend any time on these pressures. These pressures haven't always been discussed at scrutiny. Some of the scrutiny groups had the sort of light FRM to have a look at the pressures and the additional funding to support those pressures. But I'll skip that unless anybody else has got a quick question on that at all. If not, the next paper is the reserves policy. Are there any changes to that, Jane?
No, it's the same policy that was in place last year.
Okay, and the 4% has been it's about 4 years ago now, or 3 or 4 years ago. It went up from 3 to 4, didn't it?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but it was in the last few years. Yeah.
Yeah. Elwyn, I don't know. You raised it before about reserves.
Well, I just thought it needs asking and needs to be out in the public domain, I think, because people will be asking it. People see, and we often don't understand overall reserves. They just see a pot of money there. And I think when people are facing tough times and will be people see headlines of about 6 million going back to reserves at the end of last year. So people think then, where does that money go? Why can't some of that be used against to keep your even 1% low income tax? And I think it's a fair question to be asked. Yeah. By the way, I have just looked up since our previous conversation about Blaenau Gwent and Torfaen, and I can see Torfaen has 9% in free reserves, and they have Blaenau Gwent has 85 million reserves and Torfaen 61.4 million total, of when 16 million is free. So it gives a context. So in the other discussion about that extra money, we still need to argue the case, I think. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit rambling. Jane.
Okay, so if I can give a little bit of context around reserves. So yes, the council does hold reserves. They are held in a number of different areas, and I think we're quite transparent in reporting this through the budget monitoring reports as well. So the general fund reserve is the free reserve that I think you called it, stands at around 9 million, and that is based on that 4% calculation that we've set as a minimum. And general fund reserves have remained at around that level now for a couple of years. But as I said, when we were looking at the assessment, I think those are around, they're appropriate, but they are at a minimum level. But we haven't chosen to increase those over the last couple of years. We do then hold a number of specific reserves, and I'm looking at the reserves table. It's in the budget report, actually. The transport and equipment fund in reserve at the beginning of this year stood at 9.4 million. So that is the fund that we draw on to replace those vehicle costs and so on. And I think the fact that we're delaying that contribution is showing that we're not, pushing that reserve up beyond where it needs to be necessarily. There are specific reserves, that is probably the highest figure in terms of our reserves table. They stand at around 35 million. We are drawing about 7 million of those this year, but they can be there, they are there for specific purposes. So you will have grants unapplied and things like that sat in there that have to be drawn down over a specific period of time. We also have in there a capital reserve that we are using to support our capital programme, and again to keep that borrowing down. So there are a number of different reserves in that pot that we hold. And then of course you've got school reserves as well. At the beginning of last year they stood at 6.6 million, but we know schools have been drawing on those this year to cover off some of those costs. And the housing revenue account is the other reserve that we have. So I think very often, yes, when we do have an end of a year position that gives us a surplus or whatever, we're very careful about what we set aside and what we utilise and draw on for those then over the next few years. So I don't think it's a case of us building up our reserves unnecessarily. And as my assessment showed, in terms of where we are and the risk going forward and that financial resilience going forward, I feel they are at an appropriate level, and we are actively using some of those specific reserves.
Yeah.
Thank you. David first. I was a quick question on that, but David first.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The general fund reserve is all we've got basically over and above our risk reserve to protect us against the high level of risk that's already included within the budget. So to be foolhardy to use that. But I think more importantly, if you're going to use reserves to fund, for argument's sake, council tax, you're going to have to put it back next year. In all probability, you'll have to raise your council tax next year to cover that anyway. So it's not really good accounting. And it's quite interesting, you know, some of the indicative figures we've got so far. Obviously, they're not the final figures on council tax averages in Wales. I think it's averaging about 7.6%. Ranges between 3 and 15%. And what you will find is that some of those authorities that have been using reserves in the past are now setting the higher levels of council tax. So it's foolhardy, really, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to pay it back. And so you're either going to have to find that money within increases in council tax in the future or further service cuts. So, you know, that's just to give some understanding as to why we're not recommending the use of reserves.
Yeah, it's a one-off sort of funding, isn't it?
And just one other brief point. It's worth looking at some of these indicative figures. Some of those authorities that are having to set very high levels of council tax this coming year are those that have traditionally set very, very low levels in the past, and it's all beginning to catch up with it now because of these very, very poor settlements.
Okay, thank you. But the usable reserves are sort of 50 million. So if worst came to the worst, it would be possible to realign those reserves, wouldn't it? In theory, but of course, short-term the consequences.
Absolutely, you can only use reserves once.
Yeah, good. My point on the reserves table, and I made it last year. I wish you would add an extra column for the forecast position at the end of the next financial year. You got the forecast position there for March 2024. You got planned use of reserves in the capital programme and other areas. And I can't understand why we can't have an extra column of forecast position for March 2025 at the end of this.
The budget set in year.
Yes. Why not, Jane?
I don't think I thought about it. I have to admit. Be totally honest.
I said the same thing last year, Jane.
I forgot about that. So yeah, apologies. Perhaps we can amend that when we put the report through to council.
But it would give an indication of the pressures on them.
Yeah.
Sorry, Arwel was clouty when it.
Well, no, the only comment, just going on from what Councillor Elwyn was saying, really, I think we should take I think it's in the paper, it says that the powers are not proposing to use any general reserves for the council tax. So I think that line should come out of I think that's what the general public see, and I think that's what gets their backup. So I think that line should come out of the paper, personally. Okay, we still don't use general reserves, maybe for council tax, but I think that line should come out. That's my personal thought.
I'm guessing Jane would say, or David would say, it's their way of demonstrating that they're being prudent and not using. Well, I see it from.
But the general public feel otherwise. You know, an increase from 5 to 7.5%. You know, it's a difficult pill to swallow.
Yeah.
I think you can argue it either way, can't you? If you don't say it, people question, are you doing it? It's
yeah.
But you know, if you froze council tax this year, it would be a £7 million hole in the budget, which more big chunk of the general reserve would be wiped out, wouldn't it? 3/4 of it, and then the following year you would have to put it up by that's the 7.5% this year plus the additional for next year. So, you know, if it was in at 5%, you'd be talking about 12% council tax, and you still wouldn't get back to the same position because you've used the reserves. But
we're not looking at sort of a 0%. I think, you know, 5.5–6% is, I reckon, would be very acceptable, because I think, okay, there's 5 new directors appointed last week, and they all seem to think that they could make efficiency savings, and so why don't we sort of throw them the gauntlet and say, well, let's see what you can come up with.
I think you've got to look at the projections going forward, mind. We've already discussed the potential if we can't really get some positive results coming out of sustainable powers, which is what those directors were talking about, to address the potential £64 million worth of savings that are going to be needed over the next 4 years. Obviously, we've got problems, and that falls back under the need to maintain our reserve And more importantly, it stresses the fact that if we were to use £1 million with the reserves this year to reduce that to say 6.5% council tax, you can guarantee you with the pressures on next year, we're going to be setting that 1% onto whatever the council tax is going to be next year or even more. So it's false accounting.
Yeah, but 64 million and what reserves we've got, well, we've sunk anyway, haven't we?
Well, that's why we've got to ensure sustainable powers delivers.
Well,
It's a huge challenge because the consequences, you know, they're unthinkable. So we simply got to work. Simple as that. And it's not just us; it's a lot of other.
I'm not sort of denying all authorities, and then probably some English authorities are in the worse position than we are. But
some of the English authorities are already there; they've gone over the edge.
Exactly. Yeah.
But no, you know, as I said earlier on, I think we are a step ahead, and that's a credit to this authority. And yeah, we've got to deliver. Simple as that.
Yeah. The English authorities, I know there's a lot very close to the edge, but the ones that have gone over the edge, there were individual circumstances about poor investment or stuff, and not taking decisions early enough. In Birmingham, for example, around the equalisation of pay, you know, it's an inability to take early decisions, and that's, you know, back on budget all the time. Within powers, we got to take those decisions early, and I don't think we are doing it quick enough.
There's no point burying your head in the sand, is there, really?
Sorry, Arrow?
There's no point burying your head in the sand, is it?
No,
And
I think
it's all about financial responsibility, isn't it? And that we plan properly, we manage our finances correctly. And what's happening to some of these English authorities, they simply haven't done that, and they've been reckless, and we're not going to let that happen.
Yeah, good to hear, David. We've got to press on. I've got about 30 seconds left of the meeting.
Can I add one thing? I think where we've seen failures as well, it's been a result of using reserves and not tackling the in-year budget position. So again, that just adds, you know, weight to our policy, I think, as well.
And schools need to reflect on that as well. James.
Sorry, I know you. We are running short of time, Chair, but I just thought just to sort of build on Gareth Hall's point about risk and which kind of follows on from the reserves issue and whether, you know, what you do with them. I just think it's important to remember that the title Sustainable Powers is not Sustainable Powers County Council. It's Sustainable Powers, because exactly the same process is having to be gone through by all the public authorities working in the county, most principally the Health Board, but not exclusively. And it's important to note, and I think Finance Panel should note that we are having, I mean, Jane and her team are having very close keeping in very close contact with the Health Board around their budget planning as well, so that we, as best we can, align what we are doing. And I don't think this has happened much in the past. And I think one of the, you know, when we get to these really difficult periods like we're having now, it does expose the inherent weakness in the way that the public sector plans its budgets, that we do it annually. We don't do it on a rolling 3-year basis, which is what we'd all much prefer. We can only work from one year to the next because we only ever get a clear indication of the funding we're going to get from one year to the next. The same applies to the health service. And we've always planned our budgets in isolation. You know, we never ever get an early sight of the Health Board's budget, and they don't get an early sight of ours. They just accept what we set when we set it, and vice versa. And what we're trying to do, and I'm really pushing this at Public Service Board level, is to, you know, have those early dialogue when we come to budget planning, so that when we do have to make decisions, and they're all going to be horrible ones, whatever decisions we take, that we minimise the impact on our partner authorities, because there's absolutely no point in us making a massive saving, say, in adult social care, if it simply loads more cost onto the Health Board and vice versa. That's just silly. It's all the public's money. And anyway, the only people who ever suffer from that process are the people, the service users, and inevitably the most vulnerable ones amongst them. So I think we are making strides in the right direction in terms of joint planning of budgets and joint planning of services, but we are still a long way from a really holistic system. And until we get there, you know, it's absolutely essential we get there, because it's quite clear that none of the public sector organisations are in a shape to be sustainable for any more than a few more years in this area and every area of the UK, I would guess. So I think it's a shame we've got to we've come to this point where it's the budget or budget strains that are forcing us into this situation. But that's where we are, and I think, you know, in future years we've got to be at a much earlier stage in the financial year, be in discussion with our partner organisations about budgets and where they expect to be and what we can all do to help each other, because otherwise we're going to end up in a right mess. So I just wanted to make the point that it isn't just about Sustainable Powys County Council, it's about Sustainable Powys. And it's really interesting that the Health Board has accepted our model of planning for the future and their sustainability in terms of place-based planning and the carving up of the county, if you like, into the areas, the 13 areas, and the way we're approaching it. I think that's a real feather in our cap, in a sense, but it does require a really big change in approach in terms of cross-organisation cooperation, and indeed the granting of a level of trust in each other, which perhaps has not been there in the past, but we're going to have to approach. And I would include that with Ceredigion as well as our main partner, local authority, but also in the importance of the partnership working through the marches as well, the other partnerships, because I'm sure the English authorities see that as a mechanism to not just improve efficiency, but strip some cost and remove some duplication of effort, which would save cost. And they're right that we have to do it that way. We're going to have to move to a much more regional base of planning and implementing budgets, because individually none of these are sustainable.
No.
I just so I think, you know, we're at crunch point, aren't we? We really are.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, Leader. We shouldn't be precious around our resources, and we hope our partners wouldn't be the same. And it's important to look at the bigger picture of how, because at the end of the day, it's public money.
Exactly.
But it's you know, it's not just the public sector in Powys facing real crunch. You know, there's Welsh Government plans for agriculture that are just emerging now. It is absolutely shocking, and that may have a really big impact on the economy within Powys especially. But still to see the extent of that. But thank you, and thank you, James, for that. It's really good summing up.
Okay.
And sorry, lost my track a bit. We've got the capital strategy and treasury management strategy. It's an awful title to have strategy in it twice. It's one word that I struggle with. Right, Jane, are there any particular changes in this, or shall we skate through to the Appendix A?
I mean, I think there are changes throughout. They will have been updated for the relevant figures. I think our overarching strategy hasn't necessarily changed.
No, that I was looking at, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of our appetite for risk and looking at our security of investments and so on, very much still the same strategy approach in terms of that, but we will obviously have updated all of the factors throughout this document, and also reflected again on the economic context and where inflation rates are going, where borrowing rates are going, and so on. All of that will have been factored into this as well. So there are a lot of changes, but as I said, that overall strategy has not really changed significantly. The minimum revenue provision policy is exactly the same. We're not proposing any changes to that. Those are some of the big factors, I suppose, in terms of this overarching policy.
Yeah. And I know there's notes on leisure centres, and I know there's a review coming up on that as well. Housing in the HRA is fairly self-financing, so ring-fenced, and we haven't, and I don't think economy and residents really focused on housing at all. But
no,
there's a little bit around capital on that as well. But going, unless other members of the panel have got any comments, should go through to the Appendix A, if I could.
The programme, the figures.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was trying to find which page.
Page 183.
Thank you, Jane. I was still 20 behind you. Right. My only comments on this, when you put last year's side by side against this one, you can see how stuff has been shunted across. The most obvious one is Ysgol Bro Hyddgen. It makes a huge difference to the overall capital ambition for this year. It was last year you're hoping to spend 46 million, but this year it's gone down to 12 million pound, and Bro Hyddgen has been shoved across. That's just one point really, and I could see you're taking that saving of £500,000 in the corporate, weren't you? And that's a reflection of this.
It's a reflection of not needing to support that borrowing as significantly as we initially anticipated, and it also reflects the level of slippage that we've seen for a couple of years now on that programme. So again, this feeds into the debate around council tax levels and so on. If we're not necessarily going to need that funding immediately, we wouldn't necessarily keep it in the budget plan, so it's been released, but we may well obviously have to put that back in at some point in the future. But all of those scenarios have been worked through, haven't they, in terms of setting next year's budget plan. So yes, there will be additional borrowing requirements into the future of this programme. And in order to keep that borrowing down, that's why we're looking to seek alternative sources of funding wherever we can, be that through grant applications and other sources of funding there we will clearly look at. And hence the target as well for capital receipts to support the programme to a bigger extent than they have done in the past.
Okay, and you know, in this current financially, there's a £6 million programme of major school improvements. You know, with Bro Hyddgen one being shunted off, another 24. Well, it's travelled quite far along the page over the last 2 or 3 years. You know, there's consequences on the budget element, isn't it? I don't know how much maintenance has been spent on Ysgol Bro Hyddgen in the meantime, but clearly that could finance quite a bit of borrowing as well, couldn't it? Sorry, Alwyn, you got your hand up.
Well, I would just point of clarification for you. You touched on Hyddgen, wearing another hat. The planning application hasn't gone in yet. It's about to go in within about a fortnight. So obviously by the time that process happened and subsequently got to tender, they're hoping to have the contractors in place for the summer. It would be 12 months to now, really, before anybody's on site. That's a sort of timetable they envisage before there's any major expenditure. But as you say, there is a need to spend on the current building, of course.
Okay, thanks.
Ideally.
And just zooming down the page, and under vehicle replacement, there's a £5.4 million spend. That I noted that with you yesterday, Jane. There was failure to explain that at the ERCG scrutiny committee yesterday. I don't know whether you've dug that out, because you know that's 5.4 million and the vehicle reserve was 8.4. Is it directly been drawn from there? And that's why I'm keen on seeing the extra column in the revenue in the reserves table, so we can
So
see
you
the
can see
flows.
the use of that reserve. Yeah, well, we'll get that done for the council meeting. I know James is here on the call. He's our capital accountant. He knows more of the detail around this than myself. There may be some grant funding there as well. I'm not sure, but I'll look to see if James has got any more detail. James, are you there? Oh, there he is.
James.
Yeah,
good to see you.
Yeah, the majority of that is planned to come from the reserve, but obviously it depends on when we can get vehicles, what spec we need, and what we're replacing them with. But that was the latest estimates at that point in time. So
you got no idea what sort of vehicles? Any of them electric, or that might entice more grants?
yeah, well, I'm not off the top of my head, I'm afraid. No.
No. Okay. Can you, is it possible to write a note to ERCG or something just to explain? Because I think it was Councillor Adrian Jones who raised that, and I don't think the officer didn't explain it at all, to be honest with you. If a note around that could be sent to ERCG, because I think Adrian was asking exactly what that £5.5 million been spent on. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? I know that our fleet manager is discussing with Welsh Government some pilot schemes as well that they're looking to explore, particularly in a rural authority. So we don't know the detail of that yet, but I know those initial discussions are taking place. So obviously we'd look to take advantage in that regard as well where we can.
Good. It'd be good to see a note on that, explaining it ahead of the budget debates. 3 or 4 weeks' time, isn't it?
Yes.
3 or 4.
22nd, isn't it?
So 3 weeks' time then.
I don't know how many weeks, days I'm counting.
Thank you, Jane. And then the issue of the £10 million capital receipts was raised, and then capital receipts to fund capital program here is sort of 3.1 or almost £3.2 million. Is that money already in the bank?
It is. We do hold capital receipts. I think we've got about 12 million sat at the moment, James, that we will draw down on over the next couple of years.
Yeah, there's 12 million at the moment, plus whatever capital receipts we achieve in this year to go on top of that 12 million. So those first couple of years are currently sorted to be able to fund from capital receipts. It's going forward then we'll need to achieve more.
The first couple of years, as in
23
and the 2025, 26 year.
Yeah.
So the other figures across in that column are only sort of indicative.
Yes.
Okay. So in an ideal world, from your strategy, you are looking to have £10 million worth of asset sales every year. So in the lifetime of this period, you will have sort of £50 million of asset sales. Is that the aim of the council?
That's the target set currently. We will look at it year on year, and obviously Sustainable Powys and the work around that will help identify those properties that can be released. And obviously as a result of that, we'll have a number of options. We can either increase the pace of our capital financing with that extra funding resource, limit the borrowing, which inevitably then limits the impact on the revenue budget. So all of those will be looked at and factored into future strategies as we go through the next couple of years.
Because that sort of £50 million would more or less balance the potential borrowing off, wouldn't it?
Based on the current scenarios, yes, but I think we know that we will want to do further capital investment if we can, and if we can attract the grant funding from Welsh Government, particularly around schools and so on. Obviously, that we're very reliant on getting that share of funding as well.
Okay. What I know audit, governance and audit, and myself been banging on about a 10-year, switching back to the 10-year program. When are you going to do it?
Well, we have an indicative 10-year program, but at the moment we publish 5 years, and I think that's because of the level of assurance that we've got across those 5 years. You know, it's more limited the further out you get. So I think that's the basis on which we do a 5-year plan at the moment.
But we see that long timeline with reorganization of schools, capital investment in schools. It would give a far better, clearer indication of progress. Arwel, and then I'll pass Gareth is going to talk about this as well. Gareth Gunter, sorry, Arwel.
Okay, no problem.
Diolch, Cadeirydd. Yes, I must, on behalf of the Audit and Scrutiny Committee, I must reinforce your point there. I accept that what Jane has said, but I think a 10-year plan is essential just for, at the very least, for visibility's sake. Is otherwise projects in this 5-year just fall off a cliff. So you, and Councillor David mentioned earlier about it's about prudence. Well, you've got to know what you've got to be prudent about, and not having the visibility around it, I think, is detrimental to say the least. And I accept that you won't get all the figures populated, and even if it's, and I think matters are not helped because you have a global figure on the schools projects until they come to the final business case approval. And I think that is an issue. So maybe even if it's kept confidential, and because I know if you put estimates in too early, people jump on your back because they always change as and when you get more granularity about what the costs are going to be and you've been out to tender and all that. But you've got to know what ballparks you're working in with these projects, because the gestation period is so long. If you want to defer them, are you going to have a huge bulge somewhere that you can't manage? And I think this would be all grist to the mill.
Thank you. James, are you going to go in to follow up on Gareth's comments?
Yeah, well, with the schools, of course, there is some sensitivity around potential future schemes, isn't there? What may happen. So obviously publishing too far in advance may be deemed to be predetermining things or not. Welsh Government have moved to this 9-year rolling plan now going forward rather than Band A, Band B. There's a strategic outline plan with them at some point, so that will give a bit more clarity on what's in that for the next 9 years. So, and yeah, we do have the remaining 5 years as a plan, but publishing that would not be as, once you get to 5 years, it becomes quite inaccurate with costs, as we've seen with inflation for the last couple of years and delays and COVID. It really doesn't help, and don't want to promise things too early if that doesn't help either.
I'd suggest a confidential 9-year plan.
Matching it up to the Welsh Government's rolling plan is probably pretty sound. James, you put your hand down, but
well, yeah, well, yes, but Harold was before me anyway. But
well, if it's on the same topic, I think Harold is going elsewhere. I'm not sure.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I just think, I suppose the problem is that with going beyond the 5 years is the accuracy issue, the fact that the costs will change so dramatically. I mean, I'm just thinking of there's one scheme in my area, which, I mean, it's going to be a very major scheme, and if we don't do it, it's going to cause significant economic damage and frankly traffic mayhem in the area. But the bridge at Glazeborough on Wye is going to have to be replaced. At the deck of it, it's got. Otherwise, it'll become unsafe within a few years and will have to be closed, which would cause mayhem. The costs originally were put in, I think, at 4 to 5 million, and that was about 4 years ago. I think tentatively put in. I think that went up to 6 point something a couple of years ago, and the latest figures I've been quoted are between 11 and 12 million to do the work, and that's just in 4 years. Those costs have escalated like that. Now that's it's going to have to be done, but by the time, and it's now, I think, tentatively in the budget, in the forward programme for 26, 27 or 27, 28, but again, that's not set in stone. So I don't know really when it'll happen, but it will have to happen before too long. And it just shows how difficult it would be to publish a 10-year capital programme with any sense of accuracy. And then I think that I suppose that's the problem. Personally, I don't have a problem with it, 10 years, but I can understand finance officers' reluctance to commit ourselves in that way, I guess.
It's just we used to have one.
Fair comment.
And James, your bridge is not going to be built in the next in this decade anyway. By looking at the forward work program of capital
Well,
program.
no,
but-
it's not in there. It's not in there because I think well, there is a major structural repairs I see in the HTR 5 million, 5 million, 5 million. I think it says, and so somewhere buried in there, it is.
Yeah,
It's
well,
in there somewhere. But yeah, there's no. It's not a specific line. No, it's not. But it's it's one of our main river crossings over one of our main rivers, and it's going to have to be done. It's as simple as that, or it could cause mayhem. So
Yep.
it's
No,
the
no,
only route in. Yeah.
Yeah, completely agree with you.
It'd be like closing the bridge at Llannon Monarch. I mean, it's just a disaster.
Yeah, well, I got a feeling that £5 million each year is going to be spent up north in Arwell's ward. Arwell, your next question.
Thank you, Alan. I'll quote you on that, and I'm quite pleased that this meeting's been recorded. So, well, probably I should take it to the it's regarding the countryside sort of line in the budget that with capital budget that they've spent about £1 million for like the next 2 years, and then whether it's a misprint, it looks like it's going down to 15,000 a year thereafter.
I got a feeling that's really dependent on grants from Welsh Government, the footpaths. Unless
Yeah, but I know they've opened a lot of footpaths in the area now with Welsh Government funding, but well, my understanding was that Welsh Government would fund them to open existing footpaths, but they wouldn't fund them to maintain them.
No.
So I'm having a little bit of difficulty with that. Well, why open them if we can't maintain them?
There's one or two groups. I know cabinet members not here, but there are one or two groups being set up locally, volunteer groups. And I know you're very good with the spade and digging Arwell with your background.
No, okay, no, I might take it up with the.
Yeah,
okay.
but there was quite a bit of levelling up funding coming into there around footpaths and stuff. I'm not 100% sure it's reflected here within that line.
It's not a big, well, it's not a big issue, but I will take it up with the portfolio holder. Thank you.
Okay, diolch Arwel. There was one line here which I doubt has been scrutinised. It's the under finance chain. You got quite a bit of capital spend under finance.
That's where the unallocated budget sits. So I'm not spending that necessarily in our service. It's where that sits at the moment. So the small capital bids pot is there, and the pipeline projects, and of course the provision for the Mid Wales Growth Deal. That's not allocated at the moment, but that's there as well.
Yeah.
So none for me.
But it's a fairly big £7 million pipeline project. Is it all confidential at the moment, or?
I think they're still subject to approval, so there's things that we're working on and wanted to reflect in the programme, but they are subject to approval. Once approved, they would move into the various specific areas of the programme.
Okay, but capital programme, whenever we have our quarterly capital updates,
you'll see
they're always miles behind, though, aren't they? Capital spend needs to be programmed in very carefully, well ahead of time. But okay, I'm just casting doubt whether that £7 million will be spent in this financial year. That's what I'm questioning,
right, okay.
really. Karina.
Sorry, I'm on one of those footpath groups, and I was in a meeting with Sian Barnes with all of us volunteers, and she said she'd have to be self-funding from March 2025 using grant money. That's my understanding. I don't know if Jane would like to mention anything about that.
I don't think that's necessarily a decision that's been made by the council, but I suppose in terms of where we are and the prioritisation of our capital funding, the service see that very much as the way forward. If they can generate their own funding to support those schemes without impacting on the council, then of course that would be the best way to go, really.
It is a statutory duty, isn't it, to look after footpaths? Yeah. Thank you.
As a lot of other.
Yeah, that's been the direction of travel for quite some time, really, as well. But yes, you are right, Karina. It's a statutory duty, and clearly focus has to be on the most well-used footpaths, and we'll see. And there's one in my area as well. So if you want to do some volunteering sometime, Irina, and show them how it's done, please come.
I just do Knighton, sorry.
Right. Sorry, there was another hand up on, but it's disappeared. Nope.
I had my hand up.
Oh, sorry, David. It was you, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just briefly on the footpath question. I think there's some grant money being awarded through the Levelling Up or the Shared Prosperity Fund, doesn't there? And it's been led by the Ramblers Association, I believe.
I think a lot of that was on bridges across canals and things as well.
Yeah, I know that they're looking at footpath maintenance and footpath furniture. And I know they've got a meeting arranged in this area for the part of the Australian area that's outside the national park, arranged for next week, I think. But obviously they're rolling these meetings out right throughout the county.
I think they've got some SPF money and also some brilliant basic money to do some circular routes with new gates, etc. But it's just very dependent on these grants. It's not a whole over, all over approach. That's all.
And just one other point I wanted to make, if I can just go back a minute to the 10-year capital program. I can understand the need for an indicative program. I think it's already been said, I can't see how you can get an accurate program. And I'd be very, very reluctant to see it published, because the problem you get is you build up expectations. And I think that would be a dangerous precedent to set, because obviously a lot of these projects would be very, very large projects, and they're going to impact local businesses, etc., etc. And that might be very, very difficult to manage. But the program in itself, but this is fine, but I wouldn't want to see it published. No. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Right. And no other comments on the capital program or the capital and treasury management strategy? No. Good. Right. I know there's an Appendix J budget survey. One of our panel members isn't here anymore. Member for Llanidloes was going to have a couple of comments on that, but I'm sure he can forward them to you, Kath. Any other comments on the budget survey? No. Now impact assessments. I can't remember if it was Elwyn or Pete who wanted to raise something around affordability.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Just a quick point. Are we still core with everyone virtually having left?
I think we are. There's just the three of us makes it core. Okay, is that right, Kath?
Kath's left as well.
No, I haven't left. Yes, we are, as long as we've got three.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Good.
No, it was yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Kath. Yeah, it was just I think a quick comment earlier on. I think having seen in the cabinet report the phrase, I think, careful consideration given to affordability. I just didn't know where that careful consideration was either demonstrated or documented. What that actually meant, what we'd considered. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then Jane said it's in the impact assessment. And Jane, can you show us where?
Yeah, I'm just looking at. I think it starts on page 198.
Yes, the affordability issues. It's the economic context to start with, isn't it?
I think all aspects of this really relate to affordability. That consideration has to be balanced up with the availability of services to those residents that need them most. So it is that careful assessment across everything, and being mindful of the number of council taxpayers that pay full council tax. I think we have about 50% of residents actually pay the full level of council tax without some level of discount or exemption. So it's just looking at all of that, comparing ourselves with the rest of Wales. And as you rightly pointed out previously, our average council tax is in the higher quartile there. And again, that's reflective of our council tax base and so on. So I think it's various aspects that have to be considered rather than just purely the council tax figure itself. So I hope that gives a bit more context in there, but I'll see if anybody else wants to make any comments.
Yes, if you multiply the band D level by the council tax base of 64,000, I think it comes to 130 odd million pounds ish. I wrote it down here, but I can't find it. And the council tax base is just 105 million pounds. So there's that gap between the two is the level of the discounts applied to various categories of council taxpayers. Councillor David.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Chair, that obviously when we're talking about affordability, the easiest option for this cabinet would have been to turn around and say, all right, well, we'll cover the £18.4 million of cost of pressures through an increase in council tax, and we'd have been looking at an increase of 18 to 19% in council tax, and it's very obvious that wasn't going to be affordable, and there would have been practical difficulties around that anyway with regard to collection. So we had to look at other options, and we had to balance the level of efficiencies we were creating within the £10 million against the 7.5% council tax increase, and look at the impact on the residents of Powys through those measures. And I think that's a fair balance when you consider that as far as the most vulnerable are concerned, we've increased the CTRS element, etc. So I think it's a fair balance.
Yeah, I think all budgets are a balance between those various elements of efficiency and income. Councillor Pete.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I suppose just a final comment for me. I know it's difficult because I guess you do have to talk in generalizations rather than specifics, but I suppose the bit is when we look at some of the cost reductions, we've gone down to a low level of detail, talk about, I think, as we said earlier, 20 grand on flagpoles. And I just guess then where I suppose I was trying to get to is probably band E's and above are the ones that have less of the discounts, for example. So they're going to be taking a bigger share of this hit. And it was just trying to understand what the consideration had been for them specifically, rather than generalization, especially when we may have heard as earlier, there could be the situation of, say, an elderly widow living in an inherited large property, when we know council tax is based on property values. So yeah, but I think the question was answered. Thank you.
Yeah, a widow would have that single person discount, obviously, and clearly, council tax does impact people in a different way and doesn't reflect the ability to pay, and that's a real worry around the council tax reform that's coming down the line that the Welsh Government are consulting on at the moment, which is incredibly important to respond to. Jane.
Yeah, just for information as well, looking at the number of claimants under the council tax reduction scheme, I think the figure changes obviously year on year, but we've got about 9,000 people actually getting something from that reduction scheme, and they do vary, but we are seeing there's probably 1,000 or more people above a band E that actually get some relief under that scheme as well. So obviously, that's taking income levels and so on into consideration as part of that as well. So although the majority is against the lower bands, there is some input from that scheme as well at the higher bands across the authority.
Thank you, Jane, for that. Look a bit more detail. Any other comments on the impact assessment that Jane and the team pulled together? No. Just a quick one. Just because I've seen it again, it's around the AEF. What does that stand for?
Aggregate external finance.
And it's allocated to the various services, isn't it? Or how does it work?
The AEF is the overarching funding that we get from Welsh Government, and it's made up of the revenue support grant and an NDR
oh, yes, sorry.
allocation. so the non-domestic rates allocation that we get as an authority. So those two elements constitute the AEF.
So yeah, that wasn't what I was thinking of. There's a standing standard spending assessment is
The
what I was thinking.
SSA.
That's what I was thinking of, Jane.
Yeah.
So that drives the funding as well, doesn't it, to some degree? Do any of our services we deliver, are they always funded above that level or not?
It varies. The standard spending assessment it's the assessment that's made across the formula of the relative need to fund services. So it is based on a model that would be equal across Wales. It is based on a number of assumptions. They do look at spend incurred across each authority. You may be aware of me talking about RO forms and RA forms. All of that data is collected by Welsh Government, and that basically informs the buckets, if you like, of funding. So how much is being spent on social services, how much is being spent on schools nationally. All of that data comes together, and it's how the formula is then calculated. It is not an indicator of exact need. It is a means of distributing the funds, very similar to the way we distribute funds across our schools delegated. Yeah. So it is made up of those individual assessments. Now, not every service across the authority has its own standard spending assessment. Some things do not feature there at all. Some of the services budget may be above or below those SSA calculations. It is just, purely the means of how the formula is generated.
Would it be a huge job of work to look at the variations between standard spending assessment and the actual spend across the council or not? Just for interest.
It's not perfect because, like I said, there's not all services have a specific standard spending assessment. So we can look at it, and we do look at it for our own benefit, obviously. But it is unhypothecated, and it is then for the council to decide how it spends that funding based on the services we provide.
But it be an indicator to me where our priorities lie, and also where possibly the funding model diverts from the reality as well. You don't look at that as a regular basis. It'd be a separate job of work with it to have a bit of analysis around that.
To pull it all together, it would be a separate piece of work. We do look at it annually so that we can see where the increases are in terms of those standard spending assessments. So that's part of informing the budget debate.
Okay, would it be sometime when you have a quiet moment?
Okay.
And unlikely to happen, I know. Right, that's all. We've gone through the. Have we? Just double checking. Going back to the agenda, we've looked at all areas, have we? We haven't missed anything out, Kath?
Not that I'm aware of, Chair, no.
Okay. Right, diolch yn fawr iawn. We run over time as well. But thanks to all members who've stuck with us, and thank you, David. And I don't know if James is still here. James is still here. But I mentioned that potential of £1 million extra. Where would you spend it, James?
Gosh, what a question. I know where Jane wants to put it, but I'm not sure I totally agree with her. But I would expect a vigorous debate in Cabinet about that. It's a difficult one, isn't it? I suspect if you asked every member of council, you might get a different answer. Well, so a lot would want to reduce council tax burden, and very understandable. Take a percentage off it, wouldn't it? Which would be significant. Others would want to put it into schools delegated, but then again, we've got a situation where we know from the deep dives that there are significant savings potentially to be made in some of the schools' dedicated budgets. So, you know, are you just putting more money where it perhaps isn't needed as much as people think it is? I think I'd just like to see what we get before we even start thinking about that, to be honest with you. I don't want
It's probably an unfair question.
No, not really. No, it's not unfair. But I don't think I can answer it. I'm sorry, I can't.
No.
And I'd want to hear what my colleagues have to say. Indeed, I'd want to hear what other members of the council, all members of the council have to say about it, to be honest with you. Because
Right. No. Thank you very much, James, and thank you, David, as well.
Can I just
for your time this afternoon?
Yeah, can I just say briefly with regard to that, because we're in the land of speculation at the moment, but I think I'd align with Jane, you know, if we did have that extra money, because we've got a rough idea what's coming down the line and what's in front of us and the financial challenges we're going to have to face. But you need to remember as well, we need to factor net zero into that. And there's going to be significant costs involved there. So it's just a thought, really, something to bear in mind going forward. That these challenges aren't going away. You know, if anything, they're going to be exacerbated.
Yeah, and any council tax set is recurring, isn't it?
Yeah.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Karina.
Sorry, I would love to know what Jane would put the £1 million towards.
Or she's talking about putting it in a risk budget just in case.
Oh dear.
Yeah, basically.
Well, not a risk budget. I think
Well,
I would hold it, wait in the debate for next year before deciding how to do it. So I think I would go with the budget as proposed and keep that money to help support the following year's budget. I think that's what I said initially.
Right, I won't go around Mary and Kath and Craig or James even. I wanted to ask them for their opinions. But
they'll all agree with me.
But you can send your suggestions in a brown envelope so Jane doesn't see them. Right, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you all for your time, and I'll catch up with Kath just quickly, just to have or members of the panel, whether we wanted a quick debrief for once all officers and cabinet members have left. Thank you, James. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jane. Diolch, Mary.